Welcome to Deal Ready, where we focus on topics around M&A for small business owners. I'm Phil Fitzgerald, founder of Amplify Consulting Services. In Amplify, we help small business owners plan and prepare for M&A deals. And today, I'm very excited to welcome to the show Joey Milstein, who's the founder of Gamma Point Advisory. Today, we're going to talk with Joey around his experience in M&A and working with companies in preparing for and executing deals. Joey is an expert in supply chain and logistics systems, in addition to his focus on M&A and capital raising for his clients in that market. And as promised, we're always going to do this in 15 minutes or less. So let's get right to it. Joey, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate you being here. Why don't we start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and we'll jump right in.
Bill, thanks. Really good to be here. Happy spring to everyone. Um, Really excited to share my story and share some of my ideas. For those of you that know me, I've spent the better part of my career kind of at the intersection of logistics, operations, technology, and capital. I started my career on the carrier side with global ocean carriers. Then I moved into freight forwarding and international logistics, and later on into domestic logistics and private equity backed 3PLs. But interestingly enough, along the way, I've also spent a significant amount of time working with logistics technology companies in the freight tech world, in and around capital, venture capital, and private equity. So I've kind of seen how all of these pieces come together and how sometimes they don't. Um, as you and I've shared, what I've found and where I spend most of my time is kind of acting as this translator or this bridge between these three worlds that don't always speak the same language. You have operators who understand how businesses actually run. You have investors who are incredibly strong financially, and now increasingly technology companies trying to reshape the whole industry. So that's the intersection. Is is where it's getting a lot of value and where the value is created or destroyed, and that's really where I focus.
That makes total sense. And I appreciate the analogy around the translator. I think that's very important because you have business operators and capital providers who do what they do every single day and they do it well. But when it comes time to actually bridge that gap, being able to bring the two parties together and have them understand each other in the traditional way of doing business deals, M&A or capital raising, I think you and folks like yourself serve a valuable purpose in that role. So why don't I start with maybe asking you a little bit about your experience? You've obviously worked on a number of transactions, a number of M&A transactions in your career, and I'm sure you've seen some things along the way that kind of shaped your approach. So why don't you tell us a little bit about a story, if you will? What shaped your way of thinking about things? What is maybe a deal you never forget, or something that
Yeah,
helped kind of make you do the things the way you do them?
it's a great question, and that question kind of like explains how I even got into this in the first place. Um, so it's I would say what struck me isn't really one deal. It was actually a pattern that I kept seeing over and over again over the last 20 years of my career from the operator side. I usually would come in post letter of intent or mid process, sometimes representing the seller, sometimes advising around the edges. And what became incredibly clear was that the buyer, usually a financial buyer, had built this incredibly polished model, but they didn't really understand the business and how it actually worked day to day. And in those few cases, Phil, they overpaid, not because they were careless, but because they were looking at the business through a spreadsheet lens and not an operational one.
Right.
So I found that they didn't fully grasp things like customer concentration risk that looked diversified but wasn't, or margin that appeared stable but was actually tied to a few key relationships, or how fragile certain parts of the operation were under real market pressure, cyclical cycles, things that only if you're in the industry you know can predict and can respond to. And I've seen this even more recently when technology gets later in, which I've been spending an enormous amount of time, where buyers assume that tech equals scalability or margin expansion without really understanding adoption, adaption,
Right.
integration, or how it really fits with the real workflows. And that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. I realized then that finance alone wasn't enough, operations alone wasn't enough, and technology without context was often misunderstood. So the real value and frankly where deals succeed or fail is in the translating all three. And that's kind of how I found my niche and how I got into this, sitting between capital operators and technology, helping all sides actually understand what they're buying or building beyond the numbers. This is a little phrase I coined, diligence logistic company from Excel.
Makes sense. That's very helpful. Thank you for sharing all that. Let's spend a moment on a trend that you mentioned a moment ago, and one that I think a lot of business owners are experiencing right now. Like many industries, I think it's fair to say that private equity or financial buyers are showing up more and more frequently, not just as participants in sale processes or auctions, but also proactively contacting business owners. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, in a lot of cases, they're looking at it from the standpoint of the financial lens. They're not wearing the uniform of the company. They're not on the front of the ship, cleaning the galley or doing the things that need to be done to really run that business effectively and efficiently. So, how do you kind of um, measure the impact of that movement from behind the desk to the operator's role, where folks are kind of not just showing up when there's a business for sale, but trying to actively seek out opportunity?
So great question. And again, private equity, their presence is growing, exponentially daily. 10 years ago, it was kind of just a subtopic of conversation when it came to mergers and acquisitions. And I think we're in a very different environment than even 5 to 10 years ago.
Completely
Private
agree.
like you said, private equity used to wait for processes. Now they're sourcing deals directly, building relationships early, and trying to get ahead of the auctions. So the impact, how can I say this? The impact is twofold. On the positive side, business owners have more options. So they have more visibility, in many cases, better valuations because there's more competition. But the flip side is there's also a lot more noise. Not every buyer, in this case, private equity, understands the industry. Not every buyer understands how technology actually fits into the business. And not every inbound email represents real executable capital. So what I'm seeing is the best outcomes happen when there's some level of filtering, positioning, and strategy around who you engage with, not just reacting to inbound interest. Um, you know, the more buyers, because the more buyers doesn't always mean better buyers.
Right. I just saw a stat this morning I thought was really interesting. There was someone talking about a process they ran where there were 200 outbound inquiries to potential buyers, and maybe two of them were ultimately qualified to pursue the business because they knew the industry, they knew some of the metrics and how they operated, and had a qualifying offer with funds available that were measurable and certain. And that kind of brings to the front this notion of finding the right buyers and having the right conversations with the right people, not just knowing that there's money out there, but knowing that there's qualified money. And to your point, I think the game has changed in a lot of ways. It used to be, again, people would wait for the process, but now they're being more proactive about that approach.
Yeah,
And because they're being more proactive, they're finding their ways to opportunities that they've already pre-qualified themselves for.
100%.
So when you think about that area where you've got more folks showing up and there's more proactive approach, what does that mean for the operators, the business owners? What do they need to be doing to capitalize on that inbound interest to find the right deal when it presents itself, whether it's auction oriented or proactive?
Yeah, a great question. And I probably speak to two PE firms and a VC firm every week. People that, there's a lot of dry powder out there. People want to invest in this space, but they want to be very careful. And that's kind of where I operate. I know what's real and what's not. But in terms of what they really should do before the buyers start reaching out, the biggest mistake I see is owners waiting until someone knocks on the door to start
Right.
thinking about a transaction. So what I tell owners, even if you're thinking about it, if you wait, by then you're reacting instead of controlling the process. The
Right.
best operators I've worked with, they start early. They clean up financials, their balance sheets, their P&Ls, their income statements, but more importantly, they understand how their story will be perceived across three dimensions: operational strength,
Mhm.
financial performance, and, like we've been discussing, increasingly their technology story. We
Right.
can't avoid it. The technology and AI, it's a monsoon, a tsunami that's hitting us, and we have to adapt and we have to adopt. Um, so these operators, they think about things like, what are my real risks? How dependent am I on certain people or customers, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation? How transferable is the business? And
Hmm.
where does technology actually add value versus just being a talking point? Because ultimately valuation is everything, but it's not just math. It's confidence, and confidence comes from clarity, preparation, and credibility across all of these areas. So the earlier you start, the more leverage you have, and if you wait for the first call, you've already lost the leverage.
Well, that makes a ton of sense, and I completely agree. I talk about that a lot with business owners. Is not necessarily waiting for that opportunity to exit, but being ready for that opportunity whenever it might come, either by decision or by happenstance. Whether you decide you're going to move forward or someone kickstarts that process for you, being ready
100%.
to have that conversation is the most critical thing you can do, even more so than shaping your operations. Because I think there's a lack of patience in the market today because there's so many different providers of capital or buyers looking for opportunities. They find themselves in competition all the time, so their patience level is low. But I think that actually has a counter effect too, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. When you think about a buyer reaching out, they have a lot more conviction around what they're looking for today. So
100%. Yep.
how do you see it playing out in terms of the decision cycle and how quickly they get from knocking on the door to knowing whether it's let me put an LOI out or let me move on to the next?
Great question. So this is, complementary or supplementary to what we talked about before, the owners or the sellers. So in speaking with both strategics, companies that are looking to acquire, or more commonly, the capital people, VCs and private equity, what buyers are really looking for today, Phil, is especially in logistics and supply chain, is durability.
Right.
Can this business perform through cycles? Then scalability. Can it grow without everything breaking? And maybe most importantly, independence. Is the business reliant just on the owner, a few customers, or on a few key employees? This is an area that I think both buyers and sellers fell short, which is key to success and integration and growth. Are those three things? Is a business reliant on an owner, a few customers, or a few key employees? Because those are the things that make deals fragile.
Right.
The more institutional and repeatable the business is, the more valuable it becomes. And on the technology side, buyers are getting more sophisticated. They're not just asking, do you have tech? They're asking, does it drive visibility? Does it improve margins? Does it strengthen my EBITDA? And then does it actually get used? Because, as we discussed, real tech enablement creates value, and the superficial stuff just creates noise. So
Right.
at the end of the buyers don't pay for potential; they pay for repeatability.
Right. So as we start to wrap up here, are there any attributes that you're seeing buyers really prioritize as it relates to business owners that, with or without this thing, it's a decision point for the buyers?
You know, I'll leave it at this. At the end of the day, the deals that work aren't the ones with the best models. They're the ones where operators, capital, and technology are actually aligned and understood. And that's where, most deals fall apart. Um, that translation between those worlds is missing. And that's the gap, and that's also the opportunity.
That makes sense. I would agree with that. Well, I promised we would keep this under 15 minutes. This is a great point to kind of wrap up the conversation. So let me start by saying thank you to Joey for joining me today and for sharing your experiences and insights. I'm sure we'll have you back for another conversation
Yeah.
soon.
Phil, anytime. This is great. Thank you for doing this. It's been great getting to know you. You're definitely an M&A icon. So let's stay close, and I'm happy to do it again and happy to answer any questions.
Appreciate that. And I would encourage anybody who's out there watching, please feel free to reach out to Joey. We'll flash his contact information on the screen, both during the video and also at the end. And of course, if you're a small business owner starting to think about M&A, Amplify can help with that as well. Anyway, this has been Deal Ready. Thanks for watching or listening. We'll be back with another conversation around M&A for small business owners soon. And again, thank you to Joey Milstein from Gamma Point Advisors for joining us today.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.